curb violence against people of African descent. Just last June, a new set of measures was launched with a view to promoting racial equality and awareness in Brazil, including training programs for public security officers. In line with our traditional engagement in this crucial issue, we joined consensus on Resolution 43/1, and we will continue to support efforts towards the protection of the rights of Africans and people of African descent. I thank you.
Thank you. Et maintenant, je donne la parole au Togo pour une déclaration préenregistrée.
Madame la Présidente, le Togo salue la tenue de ce dialogue sur le racisme systémique et félicite la haute commissaire pour son rapport qui fait observer à juste titre que le meurtre de George Floyd a marqué un tournant dans la lutte contre le racisme et la discrimination raciale, la xénophobie et l'intolérance qui y sont associées. Ce drame a été en effet le catalyseur d'un sursaut collectif face au fléau insidieux du racisme auquel plusieurs pays sont confrontés, et particulièrement le racisme systémique dont sont victimes les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Le Togo soutient que la combinaison des initiatives au plan national, tenant compte de l'histoire, des réalités socio-culturelles et donc de l'ampleur des défis qu'il implique, ainsi que la mutualisation des efforts et le partage des bonnes pratiques au plan international contribueront à une réponse efficace contre cette grave violation des droits de l'homme qu'est le racisme. À cette fin, nous saluons le document de séance qui accompagne le rapport de la haute commissaire et qui vise à mettre sur pied une sorte de justice transitionnelle basée sur la responsabilité et les réparations. Le Togo encourage le Conseil à s'approprier ce document, notamment en vue de l'instauration d'un mécanisme approprié pour relever le défi que constitue pour l'humanité tout entière la lutte contre le racisme systémique. Je vous remercie.
Merci. And now I give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic on Zoom.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. تؤكد سوريا على مضمون إعلان وبرنامج عمل ديربن بمناهضة العنصرية والتمييز العنصري وكره الأجانب وما يتصل بها من تعصب، وتعرب عن قلقها من تصاعد الجرائم وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان المدفوعة بخلفيات عنصرية في العديد من الدول، مع تكرار الأحداث المماثلة لحادثة جورج فلويد المأساوية وخطابات بعض السياسيين الغربيين التي تنشر الكراهية وتحرض على العنف والوصم والتمييز، وترحب في هذا الإطار بتقرير المفوضة السامية حول العنصرية الممنهجة. من المثير للقلق أن جائحة كورونا أثرت بشكل غير متناسب على الأشخاص المتأثرين أصلاً بأشكال التمييز الهيكلي والعنصري التي أعاقت وصولهم إلى الخدمات الصحية والرعاية الطبية المنقذة للحياة واللقاح، ما جعلهم أكثر عرضة للعدوى وللموت. وهنا تدين سوريا بشدة الممارسات العنصرية التي ينتهجها الاحتلال الإسرائيلي في الأراضي العربية المحتلة، وسياسات الاحتلال والعقوبات وفرض الإجراءات الاقتصادية الأحادية القسرية ضد شعوب محددة لخنقها والضغط عليها ومعاقبتها على خياراتها السياسية، باعتبارها بعض أسوأ أشكال العنصرية والتمييز العنصري المعاصر، وتطالب بمكافحتها ووقفها. شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this was the last speaker that we could accommodate at this meeting, and this also brings us to the end of the meeting. But no worry, it is not the end of our interactive dialogue. Before we conclude, however, I would like to remind all delegations to deliver their statements at a reasonable pace in order to allow for proper interpretation. Now we will take a technical break of 5 minutes before continuing the interactive dialogue on the report of the High Commissioner on Systemic Racism, followed by the presentation of her oral update on the cooperation with Georgia under Agenda Item 10. I hereby close the 33rd meeting of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council.
Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 34th meeting of the 47th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now resume the interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner on her report on systematic racism pursuant to Council's Resolution 43/1. It's my honor to welcome back to the podium Ms. Michelle Bachelet, High Commissioner for Human Rights. We shall now return to the list of speakers. I give the floor to China for a video statement.
女士，今年是德班宣言和行动纲领通过20周年，国际社会反对种族主义、种族歧视、仇外心理和相关不容忍行为依然任重道远。我们欢迎人权高专向本届会议提交的报告，严重关切非洲人和非洲人后裔在美国、英国、加拿大、欧盟国家仍面临系统性种族主义和种族歧视，经济社会文化和公民政治权利。受到损害，在执法和司法部门遭受严重歧视和暴力。系统性种族主义需要系统性应对措施，有关国家必须全面审查和改变歧视性机构、法律和政策，包括对执法和司法系统进行改革。同时，必须通过问责与补偿，消除奴隶制、跨大西洋奴隶贸易和殖民主义的余毒，使非洲人后裔获得真相与正义。我们也对近年来美国、英国、加拿大、澳大利亚和欧盟国家针对亚洲人和亚洲人后裔的歧视和仇恨犯罪急剧增多深表关切。国际社会对系统性种族主义不应再无所作为。我们期待人权理事会、人权高专办等多边人权机构为实现人人平等、没有歧视的包容性社会发挥应有作用。谢谢主席女士。
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Mexico for a video statement.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Agradecemos a la alta comisionada la presentación de su informe. Reconocemos que las personas afrodescendientes enfrentan alrededor del mundo formas múltiples e interseccionales de discriminación y exclusión, que provienen de un legado histórico y que se han perpetuado dando lugar a desigualdades estructurales. México coincide en que para hacer frente al racismo sistémico se requieren respuestas sistémicas que involucren y tengan un impacto en las instituciones gubernamentales y en la sociedad en su conjunto. A nivel nacional, hemos adoptado medidas para dar mayor visibilidad y reconocimiento institucional a las personas afrodescendientes, así como estrategias para transversalizar los principios de igualdad y no discriminación en el marco jurídico, incluyendo las disposiciones y políticas en materia de uso de la fuerza. Siendo este un tema que requiere de la voluntad política y el involucramiento de todos los estados, sorprende el limitado número de contribuciones al informe que hoy fue presentado. Consideramos necesario que todos contribuyamos con los mecanismos que hemos mandatado para identificar las mejores prácticas y las lecciones aprendidas. Está en nuestras manos revertir las culturas de negación, desmantelar el racismo sistémico, poner fin a la impunidad y garantizar la rendición de cuentas. México reafirma su compromiso para contribuir en esas tareas. Muchas gracias.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Morocco for a video statement.
Présidente, ma délégation remercie Madame la Haute Commissaire pour son rapport et considère que s'il y a bien une question pour laquelle nous devons tous être engagés de manière constructive, c'est certainement celle du racisme qui est un phénomène global dévastateur qui peut considérablement nuire au progrès accumulé par l'humanité. Le Royaume du Maroc a de tout temps été en faveur d'une approche multilatérale unifiée et concertée partant de ses convictions profondes dont il a toujours fait la promotion. Dans ce sens, Le Royaume du Maroc accueillera le sommet mondial de l'Alliance des civilisations dans le but de contribuer à renforcer les principes de tolérance et de lutte contre toutes les formes de discrimination. Concernant le rapport de Madame la Haute Commissaire, il est nécessaire de relever la notion de racisme systémique qui représente un ensemble corrélé de pratiques, de lois et de mesures allant dans un sens contraire au principe de l'égalité raciale. C'est en ce sens que l'idée de la stratégie proposée dans l'annexe du rapport de Madame la Haute Commissaire trouve toute son essence, surtout pour ce qui est de la nécessité de traduire les 4 points évoqués par un plan d'action national remédiant à la culture du déni et en instaurant des mesures pour lutter contre l'impunité et favorisant davantage la confiance rompue jusqu'à présent. Le Royaume du Maroc salue ces propositions et y accordera naturellement tout l'intérêt et l'attention qu'elles requièrent et n'hésitera pas à contribuer activement lors des discussions à venir sur les voies et moyens pour atteindre les objectifs escomptés en la matière. Je vous remercie.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Algeria for a video statement.
شكرا سيدة الرئيسة. ينضم وفد بلادي إلى البيانات المجموعات التي ينتمي إليها ويثمن جهود المفوضية السامية لإعداد تقريرها قيد النقاش ويرحب بالخطة التحويلية من أجل تحقيق العدالة العرقية والمساواة ويدعو الدول التي تنفيذها عبر تدابير عمل ملموسة في سياساتها وخططها الهادفة إلى إنهاء العنصرية. تجدد الجزائر دعمها لتنفيذ الفعال لإعلان وبرنامج عمل ديربان لعام 2001 والوثيقة الختامية لمؤتمر الاستعراض ديربان لعام 2009 وتؤكد من جديد عن فعالياتهما كوثيقتين مرجعيتين لتعميق مكافحة العنصرية والتمييز العنصري وكراهية الأجانب وما يتصل بذلك من تعصب لا سيما في ظل عودة ظهور الأشكال المعاصرة لهذه الجريمة. إن الجزائر ملتزمة على جميع المستويات بمنع العنصرية والتمييز العنصري ولذلك تم اعتماد في عام 2020 بشأن منع مكافحة التمييز وخطاب الكراهية واللي ينص بالإضافة إلى العقوبات الجنائية على إنشاء مرصد وطني مسؤول عن عن جميع أشكال التمييز وخطاب الكراهية وتحليلها واقتراح التدابير والإجراءات اللازمة للوقاية منها. شكرا.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to United Nations Population Fund for a video statement.
Thank you, President. UNFPA welcomes the report of the High Commissioner and the focus of this dialogue on systemic racism and human rights violations. As this report points out, women of African descent face multiple discrimination arising from their racial or ethnic origin, combined with GBV discrimination and harmful gender stereotyping. In many countries, women of African descent are more likely to be underemployed or engaged in informal jobs. They have less access to family planning and are more vulnerable to gender-based violence. These realities have been greatly exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Data on Afro-descendant women often get subsumed under the data of women in general, thus hiding patterns of discrimination and violence. We echo the report's way forward and call on states to collect and make publicly available comprehensive disaggregated data with strict safeguards and in accordance with international human rights law. We will continue to build the capacity of young Afro-descendants and call for the removal of all barriers to their full and meaningful participation in line with commitments made at the Nairobi Summit on ICPD 25. UNFPA remains committed to support the full implementation of the program of work of the International Decade of People of African Descent as we celebrate and take stock of its midterm review. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Venezuela for a video statement.
Agradecemos a la alta comisionada por su informe sobre el racismo sistémico, las violaciones de los derechos humanos por las fuerzas del orden contra los africanos y afrodescendientes y sobre la muerte de George Floyd. A mitad del decenio internacional de los afrodescendientes, los retos que enfrentan siguen siendo numerosos, especialmente en los países desarrollados donde con frecuencia son víctimas de exclusión, discriminación y pobreza. Este grupo vulnerable es objeto de graves violaciones de sus derechos humanos. Preocupa el aumento de los discursos de odio y xenofobia por parte de algunos líderes políticos en países desarrollados. Las protestas contra el racismo en Estados Unidos tienen un carácter multiétnico y se han replicado en todo el mundo, demostrando que las ansias de justicia, libertad e igualdad son patrimonio universal del ser humano. Rechazamos la brutalidad policial y las violaciones de los derechos humanos generadas en ese contexto. El asesinato de George Floyd es la dramática evidencia de que los prejuicios supremacistas perviven en las sociedades de los países desarrollados, consentidos por las potencias occidentales que con medidas coercitivas unilaterales y legales pretenden asfixiar a los pueblos del sur. Venezuela solidaria se une a los que luchan por la igualdad, contra el racismo, la discriminación racial, la xenofobia y las formas conexas de intolerancia hacia una sociedad verdadera, democrática y con justicia social. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to United States of America for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam High Commissioner, for this insightful and forthright report, which underscores that systemic racism demands a systemic response and calls for an agenda that promotes accountability and redress for victims. The United States is addressing these challenges at home and abroad, honestly and transparently, by tackling the underlying issues of racial discrimination and the use of excessive force in policing. This includes President Biden's executive order to advance racial equity and support for underserved communities across the whole of government, as well as U.S. Department of Justice investigations into cases involving a pattern or practice of conduct by law enforcement officers, agencies, departments, and offices that violate constitutional or federal rights. With humility and introspection, we also say that racial inequality is a challenge faced by every state, including the United States, but together we can overcome it. We all can and must do more. And we look forward to working with the international community to promote respect for human rights for all, and we encourage this Council to continue to address this critical issue. My question is this: Madam High Commissioner, what can the international community do to elevate the voices of people of African descent in policymaking?
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Egypt for a video statement.
السيدة الرئيسة، تعرب مصر عن القلق إزاء استمرار مظاهر العنصرية وكراهية الأجانب وعنف الشرطة تجاه المنحدرين من أصول أفريقية في عدد من الدول، خاصة في الدول المتقدمة. كما أشارت مصر في دورات سابقة إلى خطورة استمرار الخطاب السياسي المعادي للمهاجرين. إن هذه الممارسات المؤسفة تحتم تضافر الجهود الدولية لاحتواء تصاعد هذه الانتهاكات وإعلاء قيم التسامح والاعتدال وقبول الآخر ونبذ العنف والتطرف والكراهية والعنصرية. في هذا السياق نعرب عن القلق إزاء استمرار انتشار ظاهرة الإسلاموفوبيا في بعض الدول الأوروبية. ففي ألمانيا لا تزال المواطنات المسلمات يتعرضن للتمييز لا سيما بسبب ارتدائهن للحجاب، فضلا عن استمرار الهجوم على المساجد والمباني التابعة لها من التيارات المتطرفة. وتؤكد مصر في هذا الصدد أهمية ضمان المساءلة عن الأسس العنصرية لجريمة قتل الطالبة المصرية شادن محمد. أما في النمسا فنعرب عن الأسف لسابق قيم المفوضية السامية لشؤون اللاجئين بتوجيه الاتهام لها بإعطاء الأولوية لإعادة التوطين وليس لاعتبارات حقوق الإنسان، فضلا عن شواغلنا إزاء زيادة الخطاب المعادي للأجانب هناك. فيما نأمل أن تولي الولايات المتحدة اهتماما أكبر بالتعامل مع المشكلات التي يتعرض لها المهاجرون واللاجئون وطالبو اللجوء، وندعو السويد إلى اتخاذ إجراءات لمنع تكرار الحوادث الخاصة بحرق وإهانة القرآن الكريم والاعتداءات ضد المساجد ووضع حد لطول فترات الحبس الاحتياطي. شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Kenya via Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We welcome the comprehensive report of the High Commissioner and align ourselves with the statement delivered by Cameroon on behalf of the African Group. Kenya government reiterates its unequivocal anti-discrimination message through political goodwill and adherence to international human rights law, as well as implementation of the DDPA. In this regard, we join the international community in condemning racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance, and in particular, the fight against structural and systemic racism. We also join the call to change mindsets in addressing racial justice and equality at all levels. While welcoming the progress made in implementing DDPA so far, challenges still persist in many parts of the world as countless populations continue to be victims of racism and related intolerance, including police brutality and the use of excessive force by law enforcement agencies. Kenya encourages states and other actors to constructively engage with the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights to participate in the activities that are aimed at full implementation of Resolution 43/1 and any other mechanisms with the ultimate goal of achieving her transformative agenda in racial justice and equality. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Saudi Arabia for a video statement.
السيد الرئيس، إن العنصرية والتمييز العنصري وكراهية الأجانب وما يتصل بذلك من تعصب هي من الآفات المقيتة والتي تستلزم بذل المزيد من الجهود على المستوى الدولي من أجل مكافحتها والقضاء عليها. وفي هذا الشأن تؤكد بلادي التزامها بحظر التمييز العنصري وكافة الأشكال والأنماط المعاصرة للعنصرية، وتدعم كل الجهود الدولية في هذا الإطار، ذلك استنادا إلى التزام المملكة بأحكام الشريعة الإسلامية وأنظمتها التي تتضافر لحظر أي تمييز ينتج عنه تعطيل أو عرقلة الاعتراف بحقوق الإنسان والحريات الأساسية أو التمتع بها أو ممارستها. المملكة طرفا في الاتفاقية الدولية للقضاء على جميع أشكال التمييز العنصري، وبالتالي فإن الاتفاقية تعتبر جزء من القوانين الوطنية، والجدير بالذكر أن إعلان برنامج عمل ديربان من المعايير التي يتم الاستناد عليها في تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان ونشر الوعي بها في المملكة. السيد الرئيس، إن الإساءة للإسلام تعد إحدى أكثر الأشكال المعاصرة للعنصرية، وقد تجسدت في واقعنا اليوم ظاهرة الإسلاموفوبيا لمعاداة كل ما هو إسلامي. وفي هذا الشأن تؤكد بلادي بأنه لا يمكن التذرع بممارسة الحق في حرية الرأي والتعبير لبث العبارات العنصرية والاعتداء على الشعوب والثقافات والزعم بالتفوق العرقي لأمة على أخرى. وتؤكد في ذات السياق على أن يمارس الجميع حقوقهم في إطار من الوعي والمسؤولية واحترام الآخر تحقيقا للتسامح ونبذ الكراهية. وشكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Botswana for a video statement.
Madam President, we align to the statement of the African Group. On May 2020, crowds of people chose to stand up and protest against the tragic passing of George Floyd, calling out countless injustices and brutality faced by Africans and people of African descent. What followed was an outpouring of support and solidarity from all over the world, leading to an HRC resolution requesting for this report. We welcome the High Commissioner's report, which highlights the entrenchment of systemic racism, compounded by historical ties to slavery and colonialism. It points to how this has shaped the interactions of Africans and people of African descent with law enforcement officers and the criminal justice system. The report underscores a lack of political will to fully confront systemic racism in the past and reflects on the importance of using this momentous opportunity created by a renewed and overwhelming global interest to mark a turning point by implementing the recommendations of the report. Of particular importance is the annex to this report, detailing a 4-point agenda towards a transformative change for racial justice and equality, as well as a recommendation to mandate a specific mechanism in order to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. It is our firm belief that this ambitious approach properly targets ending systemic racism and address racial discrimination and violations by law enforcement. To this High Commissioner, we pledge our full support to the implementation of both the agenda as well as the recommendations contained therein. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. I give the floor to Namibia for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. Namibia aligns itself to the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group and the NAM. We thank the High Commissioner for her report presented pursuant to Resolution 43/1. Namibia is deeply alarmed by the report that over 190 deaths of people of African descent were at the hands of law enforcement officers. Despite all our efforts, systemic racism continues to plague our societies. Namibia strongly believes that we all have a collective responsibility to eliminate these ugly practices because there should be no place for racism in any society anywhere in the world. In our view, it is imperative to take concrete action against systemic racism. We therefore welcome the recommendation of the High Commissioner on the establishment of a specific mechanism. Racism is a global concern, and states cannot in good conscience oppose the establishment of an international independent expert mechanism which is intended to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. We therefore encourage states to support the establishment of this independent mechanism under Resolution 47/8, which will be presented to the Council for adoption during this session as a follow-up to Resolution 43/1. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I give the floor to South Africa for a video statement.
Madam President, South Africa aligns itself with the statement made by the African Group. We appreciate the comprehensive report highlighting those incidents that resulted in the murder of George Floyd and other Africans and people of African descent as mandated by HRC Resolution 43/1. My delegation applauds the High Commissioner's recommendation, and for that reason, the African Group heeded her call in its draft resolution HRC 47/L8, asking for the Council to sustain its close engagement on these issues and establish an international independent expert mechanism to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement in all parts of the world. Colonialism and slavery are at the core of systemic and structural racism, and a denial of this should not only be frowned upon but should be rejected. Madam President, many Africans and people of African descent have been murdered at the hands of law enforcement, including a South African national, Mr. Lindani Myeni, whose only crime, like many Africans and people of African descent, was the color of his skin, and as such presumed a criminal. As it was the case in 2020, the attention of the world is focused on this Council for real action, not mere political rhetoric. In conclusion, as we gear up to mark the 20th anniversary of the DDPA, we again call on the Council with all the other stakeholders to work together to stem the tide of the demon of racism and other intolerances in the spirit of the Durban Declaration. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Austria for a video statement.
Thank you. Madam High Commissioner, Austria welcomes the publication of your report and the agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality contained therein. Combating racism and racial discrimination requires us to reverse cultures of denial, end impunity for human rights violations, and ensure that the voices of people of African descent are heard and that their concerns are acted upon. The murder of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, and mass protests worldwide have marked a watershed in the fight against racism. Today, there is broad acknowledgement of the systemic nature of racism and of the need to address the legacy of past transgressions. However, let's be clear, racism is a global problem, so there is an important role for the multilateral system when it comes to eliminating racial discrimination in all its forms. We welcome the efforts of numerous UN entities, such as the Special Procedures, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and OHCHR, to address the issue of racism and racial discrimination, including police brutality against Africans and people of African descent. Over the past years, these mechanisms have produced volumes upon volumes of pertinent recommendations. Now, we should focus on turning these into action. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Azerbaijan via Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. We take note of the comprehensive report of the High Commissioner submitted to this interactive dialogue. It should be acknowledged that, unfortunately, racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, religious and other related intolerance are on the rise around the globe, despite the adoption of various important international instruments and existence of different mechanisms dealing with those issues. It's important to note that the effective functioning of national preventive mechanisms, bringing those responsible for unlawful use of force and racial motivated violence in the law enforcement authorities, and pursuing comprehensive national policies and practices for combating widespread racism and other related forms of intolerance are among the measures to be considered seriously. In order to effectively addressing the above-mentioned dangerous trends, enhancement of international cooperation should be the center of attention as foreseen by the Durban Declaration and Program of Action. Result-oriented steps by the international community are required for effective implementation of the universal agreed documents in the fight against these dangerous trends, and also for assessing the need for developing any appropriate additional international instrument. We believe that international cooperation, including programs promoting intercultural and interconfessional dialogue and tolerance, should be enhanced for achieving better results in combating racism and other related forms of intolerance. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Belarus for video statement.
Внимание Совета к проблеме системного расизма, проблеме, которая давно и надолго укоренилась в первую очередь в странах Запада. Ознакомившись с докладом Верховного комиссара ООН по правам человека, подготовленным во исполнении резолюции 43/1, несложно заметить, что он не дает представления о масштабах проблемы в странах-членах Европейского Союза, в Австралии, Великобритании, Канаде и некоторых других странах. К сожалению, отсутствие критической массы информации по западным странам стало нормой в работе УВКПЧ и некоторых мандатариев спецпроцедур. С трудом можно найти реакцию управления на факты проявления системного расизма в новостных сообщениях или комментариях его функционеров. Мы полагаем, что подобное преднамеренное или непреднамеренное замалчивание проблем покрывает нарушение прав человека и тем самым порождает безнаказанность за них. Поэтому подчеркиваю, что принцип подотчетности, который так поддерживает УВКПЧ, должен в равной степени касаться нарушителей в западных странах. В данной связи мы призываем УВКПЧ и мандатариев спецпроцедур по гражданским и политическим правам занять активную позицию в реагировании на системные проблемы, связанные с проявлением расизма. Мы ждем вашей реакции на проявление системного расизма в отношении русскоязычного населения со стороны властей Литвы, Латвии, Эстонии, а также Украины. Благодарю.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Belgium for video statement.
The report of the High Commissioner is an important milestone in a year marked by greater awareness and indeed a broader acknowledgement of the systemic nature of racism faced by people of African descent. Belgium recognizes the efforts that still need to be made to guarantee a life in dignity for all. As is pointed out in the report, my country is working to examine its past. Knowing and understanding the past is a necessary step to push back effectively against contemporary manifestations of racial discrimination. Moreover, we work to fulfill our international obligations. The issue of racial profiling in police action was extensively discussed in the constructive dialogue with the experts of the CERT committee in April. Belgium will also act on the accepted recommendations formulated in May during its Universal Periodic Review. A case in point is the adoption, expected later this year, of a national action plan against racism, which will give due consideration to racism in law enforcement, alongside actions in the field of education, labor market, media, youth, and others. With this, Belgium pledges to sustain its effort and strengthen its resolve in the struggle against racial discrimination. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Nigeria via Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Nigeria aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the African Group. We commend the High Commissioner and her office for the diligent work and take due cognizance of the comprehensive report. Nigeria reiterates its strong condemnation of all forms of racism and racial discrimination, especially in the context of suffering of Africans and people of African descent in all parts of the world. It is most tragic that systemic racism and racial discrimination still exist in our world today. We remain deeply concerned that Africans and people of African descent have continued to suffer inequities and socioeconomic exclusion, in addition to egregious marginalization due to entrenched systemic racism and racial discrimination in many parts of the world. We believe putting an end to racism and racial discrimination would ensure a peaceful, just, and inclusive society anchored on respect for human rights, effective rule of law, equal opportunity for all, and good governance. In this regard, we underscore the imperative of sincere international cooperation and multilateral engagement with a view to ending the scourge of racism and racial discrimination. Nevertheless, this could be effectively achieved if we acknowledge the existence of these menace and refuse to live in denial, as aptly highlighted in the report. We also emphasize the importance of genuine commitment to the effective and comprehensive implementation of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action as we stridently work to bring an end to this scourge. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom's position on racism is crystal clear. There is no place in society for racism, either at home or abroad. That is why we are resolute in our commitment to eliminating racial discrimination and to combating all forms of racism, xenophobia, and related intolerance. Domestically, we believe that welcoming diversity in our communities and public services is key to tackling racism and other forms of discrimination. For instance, we believe that it is crucial for the police forces to reflect the communities they serve. That is why we are committed to ensuring that policing is open to a range of talent from diverse communities and backgrounds. In our drive to recruit 20,000 additional police officers, our police workforce is now more representative than ever before, with the highest proportion of Black, Asian and minority ethnic officers. Internationally, we remain dedicated to participating actively in anti-racism mechanisms. Madam President, what steps should we as an international community take to share good practice and re-energise our joint efforts on this agenda? Thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Mauritania for a video statement.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Ma délégation remercie la haute commissaire pour la qualité de son travail. Mon gouvernement a adopté la loi 2018-025 qui intègre les dispositions de la Convention sur l'élimination de toutes les formes de discrimination raciale dans notre ordre juridique interne et consacre une journée nationale de lutte contre les pratiques discriminatoires. Dans la même veine, la stratégie nationale de renforcement de la cohésion sociale en cours d'adoption prend en compte le projet de plan d'action national contre la discrimination raciale, la xénophobie et l'intolérance qui y est associée. En attendant la mise en œuvre de la stratégie, des actions visant à lutter contre la discrimination ont été entreprises par différents départements pour renforcer les capacités des acteurs de la justice pénale et sensibiliser les organisations de la société civile et le grand public. Madame la Présidente, ma délégation est profondément préoccupée par le fait que le racisme et les multiples formes de discrimination continuent encore de se manifester en créant des inégalités croissantes dont sont victimes les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine. À cet égard, nous appelons la communauté internationale à examiner l'ampleur et les effets du racisme systémique et à adopter des mesures légales, stratégiques et institutionnelles efficaces visant à lutter contre le racisme en allant au-delà de l'effet cumulé des actes individuels pour supprimer les structures et les mesures qui contribuent aux inégalités politiques, sociales et économiques. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to UN Women for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. George Floyd's murder has renewed conversations around the world about racism, inequalities, discrimination, and violations of human rights. We have seen significant progress in law enforcement and other areas, but much more needs to be done to dismantle racial injustice and discrimination in every country. UN Women acknowledges and condemns the recent rise of other forms of violent discrimination, such as anti-Asian racism. We also acknowledge that for so many women, racial discrimination is yet another barrier they face. We assert again the inherent dignity and equal rights of all people to live and to thrive, free from fear. As the High Commissioner points out in her report, women of African descent face multiple forms of discrimination. They face race and gender-based discrimination and harmful stereotyping. Race and gender, these are the two areas where discrimination is both intense and highly normalized. The Durban Declaration called for the training of public officials and law enforcement officials to integrate race and gender. It also called for women's increased participation and leadership in decision-making bodies that deal with human rights. Young Black feminists have been taking center stage in the Generation Equality Forum, which has recently culminated in Paris with the combined commitments of $40 billion to advance gender equality. Through those young women's eyes, we will be able to see where we should be. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Niger via Zoom.
Merci Madame la Vice-Présidente. La délégation félicite la haut-commissaire pour la présentation de son rapport sur le racisme systémique. Le Niger reste préoccupé par les violations des droits de l'homme à caractère raciste qui existent dans un grand nombre de pays à travers le monde et condamne tous les actes, pratiques et manifestations de nature raciste qui vont à l'encontre de l'égalité des droits et du respect de la dignité de la personne humaine. En effet, outre qu'elle constitue un obstacle majeur aux droits de l'homme parce qu'elle le place dans une condition de servilité et d'infériorité, la discrimination raciale doit être classée comme une pratique indigne et intolérable dans notre monde d'aujourd'hui. C'est pourquoi le Niger a fait de la lutte contre la discrimination sous toutes ses formes une priorité fondamentale. Dans cette perspective, le Niger est non seulement partie à la quasi-totalité des instruments juridiques internationaux et régionaux relatifs aux droits de l'homme, notamment ceux visant à combattre la discrimination raciale sous ses formes, mais aussi à adopter des textes législatifs et réglementaires pour les intégrer dans son ordre juridique interne. Pour terminer, le Niger réitère son soutien ferme au processus de démantèlement de la pratique de la discrimination raciale, systémique ou structurelle, active ou passive, notamment à l'encontre des peuples d'ascendance africaine, partout où elle existe dans le monde. Je vous remercie.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Russian Federation for a video statement.
Несмотря на решение Дурбанской конференции о необходимости защиты этнической, культурной, языковой и религиозной самобытности меньшинств и равноправия лиц, относящихся к таким меньшинствам, власти Украины и стран Прибалтики в нарушении своих международных правозащитных обязательств законодательно устанавливают запрет не только на получение образования и услуг на родном языке.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Madam Vice President, this individual who is trying to deliver a statement on behalf of the delegation of the Russian Federation is complicit in gross and systematic violations of human rights in Crimea during the ongoing temporary occupation of this Ukrainian territory, and has been directly and actively involved in Russia's aggression against our country, including as one of the so-called officials of its occupation administration in Crimea. We wish to refer to the UN General Assembly Resolution 68/262, Territorial Integrity of Ukraine, which in response to the Russia's armed aggression against Ukraine in Crimea in 2014, called upon all states, international organizations, and specialized agencies not to recognize any alteration of the status of Crimea and to refrain from any action or dealings that might be interpreted as recognizing any such altered status. This resolution, as well as the 5 annual UN General Assembly resolution, Situation of Human Rights in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the City of Sevastopol, Ukraine, clearly define Crimea as a part of the territory of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. The latest of these resolutions, 75/192, adopted last year, clearly postulates that organs and officials of the Russian Federation established in the temporarily occupied Crimea are illegitimate and should be referred to as occupying authorities of the Russian Federation. Letting this person take the floor on behalf of the Russian Federation in this debate would constitute a clear violation of resolution of UN General Assembly, which affirms the status of Crimea as an inalienable territory of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russia. We also draw attention to the call of the Vice President of the Human Rights Council from last week to all delegations to uphold UN standards when referring to countries, which remains brazenly disregarded by the Russian delegation. Therefore, the delegation of Ukraine strongly demands that this person is stripped of an opportunity to speak on behalf of the delegation of the aggressor state, the Russian Federation, during the proceedings of the Council. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. Allow me to recall on the 29th of April of this year, the Bureau underscored that pursuant to the rules of procedure established for a committee of the General Assembly, it's for each member state to designate the members of its delegation accordingly, and noted that either it nor the Secretariat has the mandate to accredit or censor the accreditation of members of the member state delegation to a UN meeting. I wish to inform you that the representative who is making a statement through a video message on behalf of the Russian Federation is included in the notification concerning the delegation of the Russian Federation as a representative of the Russian Federation for this 47th session of the Council. I ask the Secretariat to play the video message again. Thank you.
Для межличностного бытового общения на нем. Фактически уничтожается история многих этносов, проживающих на их территории многие столетия. Все это подкрепляется карательными репрессивными мерами, направленными на общественных защитников и представителей так называемых неудобных национальностей. По сути, речь идет об установлении режима сегрегации по признакам языковой, этнической и национальной принадлежности. Особенно это касается лицензированных сфер услуг. Так, представители меньшинств и правозащитники испытывают серьезные трудности со свободой передвижения, получением медицинской помощи, финансовыми расчетами.
I Secretariat to stop the video and give the floor to Ukraine for a point of order. Thank you.
Madam Vice President, we once again must insist on the impossibility of exploiting the Human Rights Council as a tool of legitimization of Russia's attempted change of territorial status of Crimea through participation of representatives of its occupation administration, including these particular individuals in the proceedings of this body. For this reason, we once again put forward our demand, well-founded from both the procedure and legal standpoints, to put an end to this provocation directed by the Russian Federation against Ukraine and this council, and to deprive this person of the floor. Thank you.
I thank you. It's for each member states to decide the members of its delegations pursuant to the rules of procedure of the General Assembly, specifically Rule 100. The Secretariat does not accredit the members of the delegation of a member state to a UN meeting, so long as the name of the individual delegate is conveyed by the permanent mission is due form. The Secretariat's role is limited to taking the necessary administrative action, particularly the insurance of a ground pass. Thank you. The Secretariat, please show the video again. Thank you.
Федерация и ее субъектами, включая Республику Крым, накоплен колоссальный опыт сосуществования в атмосфере межнационального и межрелигиозного единства многих народов, которые пользуются всеми правами и возможностями, в том числе в сфере использования своих родных языков. Готовы поделиться нашим опытом.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Vietnam via Zoom.
Madam Vice President, we thank the High Commissioner for her report and sharing her views on combating systematic racism. Vietnam's consistent policy is to ensure equality, unity, respect, and mutual support for shared progress among all ethnicities. All ethnic groups have equal rights and obligations as recognized by our constitution and laws in line with our international commitments. Besides, they have long been the beneficiaries of supportive policies and measures designed to help them fully participate in and benefit from socio-economic development. In the national response to COVID-19, especially in the vaccination program, not only minority groups, but also foreign nationals residing in Vietnam are afforded the same protection and treatment as Vietnamese citizens are. Madam High Commissioner, we are particularly concerned about the rise in hate speech and discrimination against minority groups, migrants, refugees in the COVID-19 pandemic. We would like to hear more from you on how to address this issue and ensure that all people could live in an environment that is free from discrimination and fully enjoy their human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Philippines via Zoom.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. The Philippines thanks the High Commissioner for her comprehensive report. The inclusion in the Human Rights Council sessions of a permanent agenda item on racism under Agenda Item 9 and the creation of a dedicated special procedures mandate acknowledges the pervasiveness of the issue and the need for a more institutional response to tackle systemic racism. We regret that racism remains a reality that confronts populations everywhere, with high occurrence in states with a legacy of or links to enslavement and or colonialism, as reported by the High Commissioner. The Philippines is alarmed at the surge in attacks and hate crimes targeted at racial minorities, including members of the Asian community. We welcome the High Commissioner's global transformative agenda for racial justice and equality, which emphasizes the need to reverse cultures of denial and confront historical or colonial legacies. We urge that we start with our work in the Council by stamping out practices that betray deep-seated bias and a superiority complex that imposes its will on others. We must be conscious that we do not perpetuate the very mindset of the perpetrators of slavery and colonialism and pursue enlightened actions that serve the good of all. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Djibouti for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente, Djibouti s'aligne sur les déclarations faites au nom de ses groupes d'appartenance et remercie la haute commissaire pour son rapport qui examine la manifestation du caractère systémique du racisme dans le domaine de l'application de la loi, ainsi que pour le programme axé sur la transformation pour la justice et l'égalité raciale en faveur des Africains et des personnes d'ascendance africaine qui l'accompagnent. Ma délégation partage votre analyse sur l'interdépendance existante entre le racisme systémique dans l'application de la loi avec des stéréotypes, préjugés et partis pris raciaux qui trouvent souvent leur origine dans l'histoire des séquelles de l'esclavage et du colonialisme. Par ailleurs, ces formes directes ou indirectes de discrimination, de marginalisation et d'exclusion sont aussi alimentées par des discours haineux et des idéologies extrémistes qui se normalisent de plus en plus ces dernières années, notamment de la part de leaders politiques opportunistes et extrêmes. En outre, les violations qui en résultent, comme les cas non exhaustifs des 250 décès d'Africains ou personnes d'ascendance africaine examinés dans ce rapport, ne sauraient être considérés comme des dérives ou des actes isolés au motif que les mesures prises par des États ont éliminé les structures discriminatoires sur le plan racial. Aussi, Djibouti estime que seule la volonté collective de combattre le racisme systémique et la discrimination raciale permettra de lutter véritablement contre la culture du déni en s'attaquant au sentiment d'impunité, aux pratiques répréhensibles, à la persistance des abus, notamment dans le domaine de l'application de la loi, et cela à travers des actions concrètes en vue de parvenir à des changements structurels et institutionnels. Et je vous remercie.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Marshall Islands for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the High Commissioner for a report on contemporary forms of systemic racism and racial discrimination. We note with interest your recommendation calling on states to intensify efforts to address intersectional forms of racism, discrimination, and intolerance. We particularly commend your agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality, proposing to confront past legacies, take special measures, and deliver reparatory justice. Doing this, adopting a gender perspective will be critical to understanding the unique needs of women and contributions to addressing racism. The Republic of the Marshall Islands is concerned about racism and systemic violence against persons of African descent and other visible minorities around the world. The killing of George Floyd is one example of systemic racism in society. In closing, we invite the High Commissioner to pay close attention to the intersectionality of systemic racism around the world, which can be considered as a legacy of colonialism and other forms of contemporary racism. Komodala, and I thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Tunisia for a video statement.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلاد المفوضة السامية ويشكرها على الجهد المبذول في إعداد تقريرها، كما يرحب بالمقترحات المقدمة من قبل السيد المفوض السامي بتقريره بخصوص التدابير والإجراءات الكفيلة بمعالجة مظاهر التمييز العنصري ضد الأفارقة والمحددين من الأصل الأفريقي، وتعزيز العدالة العرقية والمساواة في سياق إنفاذ القانون في جميع أنحاء العالم، وخاصة
Thank you. I give the floor to India for a video statement.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for a report on the systemic racism and take note of the 4-point agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality. Racism threatens harmony and stability in societies and undermines the value of tolerance and pluralism. As Gandhiji rightly said, I quote, "Intolerance is itself a form of violence and an obstacle to the growth of a true democratic spirit," unquote. India is a diverse, multi-religious, multi-ethnic and multilingual society, and we respect and celebrate our diversity. The Indian Constitution has enshrined safeguards against racism and racial discrimination and underlined the basic tenet of equality and expressly prohibits discrimination on account of race. These safeguards are further strengthened by our comprehensive legal framework with independent and impartial judiciary, a secular and pluralistic polity, a vibrant civil society, and free media. Despite international efforts, there are still manifestations of racial discrimination and intolerance around the world. We share the concern at the increase in the number of racist incidents in several countries. We would like to reiterate our firm commitment to the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action and seek to create more effective measures to enhance its effective implementation. We believe that the 20th anniversary of DDPA will be an opportune time for states to take stronger measures on appropriate educational and legislative reforms to guarantee racial justice and equality. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Colombia for a video statement.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. Respecto al informe presentado por la Oficina de la Alta Comisionada, Colombia reitera una vez más la importancia de la verificación de las cifras y de la veracidad de la información. En un asunto tan delicado como lo es el objeto del informe, los casos y denuncias ameritan investigaciones, procesos judiciales que sancionen a los victimarios y que se repare a las víctimas. No es serio afirmar, como lo hace el informe, que, abro comillas, en Colombia hubo al parecer 14 homicidios de defensores de derechos humanos afrodescendientes en 2020. En Colombia, el homicidio en persona protegida no es un delito menor. Una denuncia seria no puede partir de un hubo al parecer. El marco jurídico colombiano y las políticas públicas para la protección de los derechos de grupos étnicos, población LGBTI y personas en estado de vulnerabilidad no admiten el racismo ni la discriminación. No existe ningún tipo de tolerancia frente a la violencia contra estas poblaciones. Una vez más reiteramos la cero tolerancia con cualquier acto contrario a los derechos humanos por parte de cualquier servidor público. Las denuncias por posibles casos de violencia y discriminación son objeto de investigación por parte de las autoridades competentes y deben llevar a la sanción de los promotores o ejecutores de tales actos. Gracias, señora Presidenta.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to Organization of American States for video statement.
The murder of George Floyd, as well as all other assassinations to Afro-descendants due to racial police violence, are part of a historical and structural process of systematic discrimination based on ethnic racial origin. The abolition of slavery did not end stigmatization and differential treatment and exclusion of Afro-descendants. It is necessary to promote a cultural and structural change aiming to combat all different forms of racial discrimination faced by Afro-descendant people and tribal communities. States must make reforms a central axis of transformation in eradicating institutional racism present in the actions of law enforcement authorities, as well as in the operation of the justice system, which has a disproportionate impact to the detriment of Afro-descendant persons. A comprehensive and satisfactory reparation in an intercultural manner is an outstanding debt.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Islamic Republic of Iran via Zoom.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation thanks the High Commissioner for presenting her report. The COVID-19 pandemic has exposed and indeed exacerbated racial discrimination and the ensuing inequalities, including access to healthcare, education, and employment. The ongoing inequalities in terms of access to COVID-19 vaccine caused by hoarding of vaccines in the north, as well as continuing unilateral coercive measures, is only the most recent manifestation of abhorrent discrimination and racism. Madam President, the cruel killing of George Floyd and the U.S. police brutality reminded the world of deeply institutionalized racism against minorities, especially African Americans. Racism emanates from a supremacist mindset is not confined to the domestic borders. It has far-reaching grave ramifications for the human rights of other nations as well. Racism at home and bullying at the international level are two sides of the same coin. The U.S. aggressive bullying against sovereign states continue to cause gross violation of basic human rights in the targeted populations. We are appalled by the fact that contemporary form of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, hate speech, and other related intolerances continue to victimize African and people of African descent, Asian and people of Asian descent, and indigenous people, in particular in some Western countries. Madam President, my delegation expects that the report of the High Commissioner be followed up by further concrete measures and policies to address the systematic racism and racial discrimination that are deeply rooted in old supremacist illusions, colonialism, and present expansionist ideologies. I thank you.
I thank you. Now we shall turn to the list of speakers. Sorry, and now I give the floor to chat via Zoom.
Merci Madame la Vice-Présidente. Le Tchad souscrit à la déclaration prononcée par le Cameroun au nom du groupe africain. Nous félicitons la haute commissaire pour son rapport complet établi en application de la résolution 43/1 du Conseil et nous saluons l'appel qu'elle a lancé en faveur d'un programme transformateur axé sur la transformation pour la justice et l'égalité raciale. Le Tchad se réjouit du rapport de la haute commissaire qui met en évidence les inégalités croissantes dont sont victimes les Africains et les personnes d'ascendance africaine dans tous les domaines en raison de leur marginalisation et les inégalités en matière d'accès aux chances, aux ressources et au pouvoir. Nous prenons également note avec satisfaction du rapport de synthèse sur les conclusions de la réunion débat sur l'état d'avancement de la lutte contre le racisme et la discrimination 20 ans après l'adoption de la déclaration et du plan d'action de Durban et les effets négatifs que la pandémie de COVID-19 a eu à cet égard. Le Tchad soutient fortement la recommandation formulée par la haute commissaire invitant les États à traduire le programme transformateur pour la justice et l'égalité raciale en plan d'action et en mesures concrètes. Je vous remercie, Madame la Vice-Présidente.
Thank you. Due to a technical problem, I would like to give the floor again to Tunisia via Zoom.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you very much. شكرا سيد الرئيس. يرحب وفد بلد المفوض السامي ويشكره على الجهد المبذول في إعداد تقريره حول تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان والحريات الأساسية للأفارقة والمحددين من الأصل الإفريقي ضد الاستخدام المفرط للقوة ومن غير ذلك وغيره من انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان من قبل الموظفين المكلفين بإنفاذ القانون. يرحب وفد بلاد المقترحات المقدمة من قبل السيد المفوض السامي بتقريره بخصوص التدابير والأجهزة الكفيلة بمعالجة مظاهر التمييز العنصري ضد الأفارقة والمحددين من الأصل الإفريقي وتعزيز العدالة العرقية والمساواة في سياق إنفاذ القانون في جميع أنحاء العالم، وخاصة مقترحها المتعلق بخطة إحداث تغيير تحولي من أجل العدالة العرقية والمساواة. سيد الرئيس، في الوقت الذي نحتفل به بمرور 20 سنة على تطبيق إعلان دوربل لا نزال نشهد أوجه عديدة ومتنوعة من مظاهر التمييز والعنصرية الممنهجة في بعض المجتمعات خاصة ضد الأفارقة والمحددين من الأصل الإفريقي، وهو ما يستدعي مضاعفة الجهد على جميع الأصعدة الوطنية والدولية لتوصل التدابير الكفيلة بالتصدي لهذه المظاهر الهدامة. وقد كانت تونس سابقا في اعتماد التشريعات وكرس مبدأ المساواة وتنبذ التمييز حيث يبادر منذ سنة 1846 بإلغاء الرق والعبودية ليتم قضية الاستقلال اعتماد منظومة قانونية مناهضة للتمييز بكافة أشكاله. وقد تعززت هذه المنظومة في دستور 2014 من خلال المصادقة في أكتوبر 2018 على قانون خاص بالقضاء على جميع أشكال التمييز العنصري وحماية لكرامة الذات البشرية وتحقيق المساواة بين الأفراد في التمتع بالحقوق وأداء الواجبات. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
I thank you. Now we shall turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to Connectus Dioritus Humanus.
Supreme Court in the ADPF 635, which restricted police operations in favelas of Rio de Janeiro during the pandemic, the police carried out the most lethal operation in its history in the favela of Jacarezinho in May 2021. 27 civilians and 1 police officer died. Victims' families, witnesses, and human rights defenders have been threatened, criminalized, and defamed. In Baixada Fluminense, also disregarding the injunction, 415 police operations were carried out, resulting in the death of 69 people. In Complexo da Maré, between 2016 and 2020, 110 police operations were carried out, resulting in 78 deaths in affecting the right to education and the health of region's residents. In the crimes of May, more than 500 people were killed by death squad in São Paulo in 2006. No public agent involved was held responsible. Mothers and family members who seek justice are disrespected. We urge the Supreme Court to resume the ADPS section, guaranteeing the injunction and a plan to reduce police lethality. We urge this Council to establish a mechanism to increase accountability for human rights violations against Black people, especially in the context of police violence.
Thank you. I now give the floor to Office of the Human Rights Defender of Armenia.
Honorable President, distinguished members of the Human Rights Council, ladies and gentlemen, authorities of Azerbaijan continue to deepen the policy of Armenophobia, continue to encourage enmity towards Armenians. Analysis of their actions and public messages prove existence of institutional racist policy clearly amounting to fascism. Evidence-based reports of Armenia's human rights defender confirm that the organized hate speech and animosity have become root causes of widely spread ethnically based torture and human treatment by the Azerbaijani military. Currently, this policy is reflected in the actions of Azerbaijani military illegally present near the bordering villages and on the roads between communities of Armenia. Thorough analysis of about 300 videos of torture and cruel treatment by the military of Azerbaijan have revealed their inspiration by Azerbaijani high-ranking officials. All of this have been confirmed with opening of a so-called trophy park of wax figures of killed Armenians and their helmets in the capital of Azerbaijan. It is a park of chained people held as hostages. It is a museum of human sufferings, a museum that is designed to promote racism. All these facts confirm the genocidal policy of Azerbaijan against the population of Artsakh and Armenia. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you. I now give the floor to American Civil Liberties Union.
Welcome the High Commissioner's report and its groundbreaking agenda for transformative change towards racial justice and equality. We commend the High Commissioner and her team for listening to the voices of families of victims of police violence and centering the lived, painful experiences of people of African descent more broadly. As a mother who lost her only son due to police violence, I can tell you firsthand the daily struggles that families face to achieve accountability and justice. That is why MAPB works from a unique perspective that gives us the lived experiences through the lens of mothers and family members who have lost their children and loved ones to police violence in the United States. I call on the Biden administration and U.S. Congress, as well as the state and local governments where more than 18,000 law enforcement agencies operate, to heed to this report's recommendations. That is why, Madam President, we welcome the creation of an independent expert mechanism that will examine systemic racism, especially in the context of law enforcement, and help combat impunity for police brutality against people of African descent in the United States and other countries. We look forward to working with the Office of High Commissioner and the new accountability mechanism to lift up the voices and experiences of families of victims of systemic racism and police violence. Thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to International Association of Democratic Lawyers.
Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective. The IADL welcomes the High Commissioner for Human Rights report on systemic racism and police violence against people of African descent, which was prepared pursuant to Resolution 43-1. The report and its accompanying conference paper are comprehensive. Though civil society organizations and UN Special Procedures mandate holders have previously produced similar reports, it is noteworthy and holds significance that a report of this nature has come from the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The IADL thanks the African Group for its proposed resolution, which implements recommendations contained in the High Commissioner's report, including a clear outline for an expert mechanism to address racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement. We note with appreciation that both the High Commissioner's report and the African Group's resolution acknowledges that the voices of people of African descent are central to this work. We call on all nations, particularly those with histories of participation in the slave trade and colonization, to join in the commemoration of the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Action, and to take decisive steps to implement the DDPA. Thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism.
Madam President, Black Lives Matter. The statement submitted by IMADR, MRG, together with the Marielle Franco Institute and Race and Equality. We thank the High Commissioner for taking up the situation in Brazil, including the case of my sister Marielle Franco. In the past months, we had two major incidents in Brazil. The killing of 25 young black women, and on June 8th, Kathleen Romeo, a 24-year-old black pregnant woman, was shot dead. We urge the state of Brazil to put in place an independent and impartial complaints mechanism inside the policy force that contributes to guarantee accountability and respect for human rights standards, and to ensure that all cases of disproportionate use of force are investigated. We believe that there is no way to have a strong democracy when policy forces implementing racist security operations receive more funds than health and education altogether. For this reason, we call the government of Brazil to immediately redistribute and dedicate the necessary funding to address inequalities and racial injustice in the law enforcement. These are the minimum steps to end what the Inter-American Commission has described as a process of social cleansing or even extermination of black people in Brazil with the consent of the state. For all human rights violations and victims of systemic racism, we urge the UN Human Rights Council to work with states in line with the High Commission recommendations to establish mechanisms and strength those that already exist and support families and communities in access to truth and justice, reparations and guarantees of non-repetition.
I thank you. I now give the floor to International Service for Human Rights.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Premièrement, nous appelons à la réinstauration des débats généraux pour toutes les sessions du Conseil. Deuxièmement, nous saluons le fait que votre rapport ait souligné le cas d'Adama Traoré en France. Néanmoins, nous regrettons que la Suisse n'ait pas été citée parmi les pays où sévissent les violences policières à caractère raciste. Nous rappelons que les vies de Mike Ben Peter, Hervé Mandoundou, Lamine Fati et toutes les victimes de violences policières racistes en Suisse comptent aussi et que tous les États doivent rendre des comptes pour l'impunité en la matière. Quant à la France, en tant que membre du Conseil, elle est tenue au plus haut standard en matière de droits humains et a le devoir de collaborer avec les mécanismes du Conseil. Or, en matière de violences policières racistes, un climat d'impunité règne encore en France. Par exemple, après une demi-décennie de bataille judiciaire, la famille d'Adama Traoré reste dans l'attente de ne serait-ce qu'un début de procès. Lenteur judiciaire et non-lieu à répétition restent la norme en France en matière de violences policières, les rares sanctions prononcées restant extrêmement clémentes. A l'inverse, les victimes, leurs familles ainsi que leurs défenseurs font souvent l'objet d'un harcèlement judiciaire et d'intimidations affectant jusqu'à leur vie privée. Nous appelons urgemment la France à mettre fin à l'impunité pour les violences policières à caractère raciste et à la criminalisation des défenseurs travaillant sur le sujet. Nous l'appelons aussi à accepter les visites de la rapporteure spéciale sur le racisme et du groupe de travail sur les personnes d'ascendance africaine. Nous prions le Conseil d'établir un mécanisme international solide permettant que des comptes soient rendus pour les violations massives, passées et présentes des droits humains des Noirs des États-Unis, d'Amérique latine, d'Europe et d'ailleurs, notamment en matière de violences policières.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
We thank the High Commissioner for her report on systemic racism and welcome her agenda towards transformative change. We echo concerns raised in her report on the entrenched nature of systemic racism against Africans and people of African descent, which she notes spans all spheres of life from police encounters to health, education, employment, and housing. We also welcome the attention given to the legacies of enslavement, colonialism, and the transatlantic trade of enslaved Africans and how these continue to shape systemic racism in laws, policies, and practices today. At a time when a growing chorus around the world is calling for fundamental systemic reforms to advance racial justice, accountability, and reparations, it is shameful to see a number of states at the Council, many of them former colonial powers, defend a business-as-usual response to the High Commissioner's call. Business as usual will not do in addressing racism domestically, and it will not do in addressing it at the Council. The brutal police murder of George Floyd in the United States that triggered the urgent debate last year was not an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of a widespread climate of impunity surrounding police killings, racial profiling, and other human rights violations against people of African descent in many countries. Police in Brazil, for example, killed 25,000 people in the last 5 years. Black Brazilians are almost 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white Brazilians. This climate of impunity will continue until states grapple with their harmful legacies and seek to repair their far-reaching damage. We urge the Council to heed the High Commissioner's call for a specific UN mechanism to spur transformative change and establish an international independent mechanism to investigate and enhance accountability for past and current violations against people of African descent in the US, Latin America, Europe, and around.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Associo Sou Brasilia.
Madam President, the statement is drafted in consultation with Race Inequality and delivered together with Illegal World. We welcome the High Commissioner's report on systemic racism, including the formulation of an agenda towards transformative change for racial justice and equality and dimensions of the situation in Brazil. Highlighted in the report is the case of Luana Barbosa, Afro-descended Port lesbian, killed by 3 military police officers after being brutally beaten in 2016. In 2018, Marielle Franco, Afro-descendant and bisexual, was brutally executed. Marielle was a counselor in the city of Rio de Janeiro where she fought against racism and police violence. These cases remain unresolved and demonstrate how Afro-LGBTI+ persons are victims of specific forms of police violence that prevent them from being in leadership positions to denounce states' racism and LGBTI phobia. Trans persons are disproportionately affected by police and other forms of violence. About 50% of the 294 transsexual candidates were victims of threats in 2020 elections. Just in the first few months of 2021, 80 trans people were killed. There is an urgent need to create policies that protect the rights of Afro-LGBTI+ persons in Brazil. We urge the Council to establish a robust mechanism and strengthen those already in place to enhance accountability for past and present human rights violations against Afro-LGBTI+ persons globally, including in the context of law enforcement. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Harm Reduction Association.
Madam President, I speak on behalf of Harm Reduction International and other 6 organizations. We welcome the Commissioner's report and this timely opportunity to reflect on systemic racism in law enforcement. In 2019, the Working Group on People of African Descent defined the war on drugs as a system of racial control used to justify excessive surveillance, criminalization, and the targeting of people of African descent worldwide. This reflects evidence from around the world, from the US to Brazil, from the UK to South Africa, showing how drug law enforcement disproportionately targets people of African descent, with destructive social, economic, health, and legal impacts. Black people are systematically discriminated against, with distinct repercussions not only on their liberty, but also on their health and the health and safety of their communities. In many countries, punitive drug policies are key tools for the perpetuation of structural racism and the policing of people of African descent. Consequently, any effort to dismantle racist structures cannot but include drug policy reform towards the adoption of health-centered and rights-based approaches, as well as the redirection of funding from drug law enforcement to health and in support of historically marginalized and racially discriminated communities. To move closer to these goals, we recommend the Human Rights Council to acknowledge the interlinkages between punitive drug control and systemic racism, to establish an ad hoc mechanism to investigate structural and systemic racism in law enforcement, also tasked with assessing the impact of drug law enforcement of people of African descent and their communities, and request special procedures to report on the impact of drug control policies on people of African descent.
I thank you. I now give the floor to CIR Human Rights Group.
Systemic racism continues to exist because there is no systemic diversity. There has yet to be a declaration or convention on diversity that represents those who need their voices heard. Over the past 18 months alone, we have seen police brutality in countries who pride themselves on their human rights and fair and equal treatment for all. We have seen airstrikes leaving children parentless and parent childrenless. We have witnessed one of the wealthiest, most influential countries in the globe carry out genocide, and we have seen people who are hired to enforce the law killing their own citizens with near to no consequence. If this does not demonstrate the urgency for reform on the way we tackle systemic racism, then what will? 2021 marks 20-year anniversary of the World Conference Against Racism and the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Programme of Action. We as Sikh Human Rights Group believe 20 years is long enough to recognise that this declaration has further challenges. It is obvious we need complementary approaches. We refer to our written statement HRC 4753. Sikh Human Rights Group proposes a declaration on diversity and a diversity day. It will take the Durban Declaration agenda forward with positive action plans and will strengthen the rights-based approach by complementing it with inclusive approach to diversity within the state. We need to stop asking people to merely tolerate one another and expect them to coexist and thrive together.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Hado.
Madam President,
RADA welcomes the report of the High Commissioner, pursuant to HRC Resolution 43/1, urgently calling for transformative action to uproot systemic racism and violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies. We consider this call as a vital reinforcement of the ongoing efforts of the DDPA follow-up mechanisms and the International Decade for People of African Descent. The shortcomings of government responses to these efforts, including policy and reparatory justice failures, are appalling and deplorable, especially given the incompatibility of racism and democracy. Certainly, the persistence of the scourge of systemic racism demands a sustained, systemic, and holistic response at the policy, judicial, and educational levels. Presently, there is a need to historicize racism in order to fight against its intellectual legitimation. RADA recalls that the DDPA is universal. It commits us all. It must be implemented through legal reforms at the national level. Madam High Commissioner, given these challenging realities, RADA raises the following questions. Firstly, what is required from states in order to operationalize the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent as a potential mechanism for ensuring that their voices are heard? And secondly, what vision or best practices can you provide as alternatives to policing? Thank you.
I thank you. This was the last speaker on the list. I now give the floor to the High Commissioner for her concluding remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Vice President, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. Thank you for your comments and questions, and let me try to address some of them. As I mentioned, the analysis in my report was based on the over 110 submissions that we received, on consultations with over 340 people, and on the wealth of existing open sources material from UN and regional mechanisms, civil society organizations, and others. We carefully studied all the material available and assessed its credibility and reliability. There were questions and comments about the role of the Council in addressing bias and discrimination, including through existing mechanisms, and around the implementation of the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. In my report, I drew on the wealth of recommendations made by the United Nations, such as by CERT, as well as by regional human rights mechanisms, National Commission of Inquiry, national human rights institutions, and equality bodies. We recognize the importance of building on decades of research, analysis, and recommendations on the areas identified in the resolution, including the work of UN human rights mechanisms, particularly the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Special Rapporteur on Contemporary Forms of Racism, Racial Discrimination, Xenophobia, and Related Intolerance, and the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. These mechanisms and bodies provide concrete recommendations, both country-specific as well as thematic, which provide detailed guidance on how to address systemic racism, including as it relates to structural and institutional factors. I call on states to show stronger political will to accelerate action for racial justice and equality, including by taking concrete steps to implement this wealth of recommendations. My report builds on the research, analysis, and recommendations and identifies a roadmap that can help states to achieve racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent through the identification of an agenda for transformative change. In addition, there is a need for the Human Rights Council to sustain its close engagement on these issues and establish a specific time-bound mechanism in order to advance racial justice and equality in the context of law enforcement in all parts of the world, including by examining relevant patterns, incidents, policies, and processes. There were a couple of questions on rights-based approaches and good practices in policing. A human rights-based approach to policing entails putting people at the center. One concrete suggestion in this regard I have made in the report is for states to initiate a human rights audit exercise that would focus on the systemic nature of how racism and racial discrimination may manifest itself in law enforcement institutions and more broadly in the criminal justice system. Such a human rights audit should examine whether there is a disparate impact on certain communities, such as people of African descent, of legislations, policies, guidelines, and practices, as well as the personal element and contribution that individual officers may bring. It would also critically examine safeguards so that institutions can identify and mitigate the risks of stereotypes and biases. Such an assessment could be undertaken by law enforcement experts, human rights experts with expertise in addressing racial discrimination, and civil society representatives, including people of African descent. In my opening, I also highlighted the need to consider alternative and complementary methods to policing, and the use of force should be properly introduced in educational settings in cases of mental health crisis, during assemblies, and in relation to migration and border governance. Overall, my report supports call to reimagine policing and the criminal justice system by supporting and implementing community-driven models for dignity and collective safety that protect and serve all members of communities without discrimination. Community participation and engagement of affected communities is key in order to reimagine policing and reform the criminal justice system. The report recommends that the delivery of public services to the community and the needs of the community as a whole should be prioritized. This also entails balancing assignment of resources for enforcement with service delivery, dismantling militarized law enforcement tactics, approaches, and equipment, and reorganizing tasks and resources for non-core law enforcement tasks. There was also a question on prevention. Focus on prevention of violations is crucial and can be achieved through systems of oversight, monitoring, and reporting of violations, gathering and publishing comprehensive disaggregated data on human rights training and awareness raising of law enforcement to counter conscious and unconscious bias, stigmatization, and discrimination, and to ensure equal treatment of people of African descent. What is also needed is accountability for human rights violations by law enforcement as a pathway to deterrence, as well as on strengthening public trust and fostering strong relationship between law enforcement and communities. To reduce crime and increase safety, including through the recruitment, retention, and promotion of people of African descent in law enforcement and in criminal justice institutions. There were questions on good practices ensuring that the voices of people of African descent and on cooperation with civil society. In the preparation of my report, my office consulted widely and deeply, recognizing the importance of hearing the voices of people of African descent. Moving forward, states should ensure that communities of African descent are able to participate in shaping decisions that affect them and be able to fully and freely air their grievances. Meaningful participation can enable the advancement of all human rights. It is critical to ensure the effective participation and/or representation of people of African descent, in particular women and youth, at every level in state institutions, including law enforcement and the criminal justice system, in policy-making processes. Moreover, continued funding, public recognition, and support for this critical work is essential. What is also necessary is supporting solidarity among equality movement across states and regions is key to amplifying these voices and forging activism, particularly among youth. People of African descent and their organizations have played a central role in the progress achieved worldwide in the fight against racism. Their struggle and resilience is in the face of systemic racism, and their persistent advocacy work have resulted in their demands being placed on the national agenda of their country and region. Additionally, civil society has been pivotal in pressing for systemic reforms through the justice system. To move forward, communities must be able to participate in shaping decisions that affect them and be able to fully and freely air their grievances. Meaningful participation plays a crucial role in the promotion of democracy, the rule of law, social inclusion, and economic development, and is essential for reducing inequalities and social conflict. As a means for empowering individuals and groups, it is one of the core elements of human rights-based approaches aimed at eliminating marginalization and discrimination, including against Africans and people of African descent. Meaningful participation requires a long-term commitment by public authorities, together with a genuine political will, an emphasis on agency, and a shift in mindset regarding the ways of doing things. Tools are available to assist state and other stakeholders in meeting these goals. For example, specific formal and permanent mechanisms for the participation of groups that have been historically excluded or whose views and needs have been inadequately addressed in decision-making processes should be developed with the participation of those groups. Continued funding, public recognition, and support for this critical work is also essential. On the question how to counter practices of racist hate speech on and offline and groups promoting racist ideologies, one of the points of my transformative agenda focuses on responding to racist behavior, violence, and hate crimes. I call on states to do this with the full force of law and the power of leadership, including by calling out and holding perpetrators accountable. States should prevent and respond to racist behavior, violence, and hate crimes, and take measures to prevent any dissemination of ideas of racial superiority and inferiority, or ideas which attempt to justify violence, hatred, or discrimination against people of African descent. All actors in society have a role to play in ensuring that these practices are stamped out. Notably, political leaders should refrain from using messages of intolerance or expressions which may incite violence, hostility, or discrimination. They also have a crucial role to play in speaking out firmly and promptly against intolerance, discriminatory stereotyping, and instances of hate speech. There were several questions on promising practices on several aspects addressed in the report. Many were brought to our attention, and we are also included in the report and further detailed in the accompanying conference room paper. For example, the report includes the launch in the United States in 2021 of a whole of government equity agenda that matches the scale of the opportunities and challenges that we face. With regard to development seeking to address the conduct of law enforcement officers and impunity, the report includes the 2021 New Mexico Civil Rights Act in the United States and an injunction by the Supreme Court of Brazil prohibiting operations by the military police in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro during COVID-19. Further, in 2020, the Premier of Nova Scotia, Canada, formally apologized for systemic racism in the justice system and committed to engaging in a restorative process to transform the approach to public safety. The European Union, in its anti-racism action plan for 2020-2025, calls for action to prevent discriminatory attitude within law enforcement agencies and to address racial and ethnic stereotypes. And in March 2020, Argentina apologized and recognized its responsibility for the killing of a person of African descent by law enforcement officials in 1996. I encourage states to work to build on promising initiatives and to adopt comprehensive whole-of-government responses to addressing systemic racism. My report and practices highlighted therein focuses on achieving racial justice and equality for Africans and people of African descent as per Human Rights Council Resolution 43/1, taking into consideration the systemic racism that they face in many countries. There are, however, many elements of this agenda and in my report which would also be relevant to countries with other minorities and indigenous peoples. Excellencies, dear colleagues, today we have a momentous opportunity and a collective responsibility to achieve a turning point for racial equality and justice. We have a number of upcoming opportunities. First, the commemoration on the 20th anniversary of the adoption of the Durban Declaration and Program of Actions that provides an important opportunity to make advances. Secondly, the midterm review of the International Decade for People of African Descent. And finally, on the 31st of August, there is an International Day of People of African Descent. So I encourage states to engage in this event, bearing in mind the elements from my 4-point transformative agenda and use them to maximize concrete impacts towards change. I encourage the Council and states to take concrete steps to implement the agenda for transformative change and maintain strong commitment and engagement on these issues. Anything else will fail to do justice to the calls we heard from the families, from people of African descent, and from all those who stand up against racism. And my office stands ready to support all efforts in this direction. Thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank you. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the High Commissioner for her participation in this interactive dialogue. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I understand that certain delegations have requested to exercise a right of reply under the agenda item 9. I give the floor to Japan, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. My delegation would like to exercise the right to reply in response to the statement by the DPRK. Japan strives to tackle racial discrimination. There is no such policy or rule that allows discrimination against Korean residents in Japan. Instead, the government of Japan is working to eliminate hate speech against people from outside Japan. On the support systems mentioned by the DPRK, applicants that meet the criteria stipulated by laws and regulations are eligible regardless of race, ethnicity, and nationality. Applicants who do not meet the criteria are not eligible, even if they are Japanese. Therefore, it is not appropriate to claim that these systems are discriminatory. On support for early childhood education and child care facilities, those facilities that guarantee institutionally the quality of early childhood education are eligible by law regardless of the race, ethnicity, and nationality of enrolled children. Eligible institutions are not decided by political or diplomatic reasons. Similarly, on the high school tuition support system and the emergency student support handout in response to the COVID-19, institutions that meet the criteria stipulated by laws and regulations are eligible regardless of the race, ethnicity, and nationality of enrolled students. Eligible institutions are not decided by political or diplomatic reasons. It is imperative to overcome mutual mistrust and deepen coordination between Japan and the DPRK so as to realize true peace in Northeast Asia. We call on all stakeholders to share this approach and to work together for a bright future. I thank you, Madam Vice President.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Ukraine. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Ukraine wishes to exercise its right to reply in response to the statement made by the Russian Federation. We again express our protest against continuous attempts by the Russian Federation to subvert Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity and abuse the proceedings of this body by these acts. We emphasize to all participants of the meetings of the Human Rights Council the importance of using appropriate language and correct UN terminology in their statements. According to the UN General Assembly resolutions, the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol are Ukraine's territory temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation. The title used by the speaker on behalf of the Russian Federation in relation to Ukraine's sovereign territory of Crimea, such as Republic of Crimea, is a violation of international law and the UN Charter, and as such should have no place in the proceedings of the UN Human Rights Council or any other UN body. We find it unacceptable that a country such as the Russian Federation, who continues to pursue the policies of racial discrimination, including in the occupied territories of Ukraine, as established by the International Court of Justice in 2017, resorts to lecturing other states on the respect of human rights, which they themselves blatantly disrespect. I thank you.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Brazil. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Vice President. Brazil would like to exercise its right of reply to the statements made by civil society during the interactive dialogue in follow-up of Resolution 43/1. As referred in our national statement in the ID, first and foremost, we regret the incidents that led to the deaths mentioned in the High Commissioner's report. We also deeply deplore the other incidents subsequently mentioned. The Brazilian government has fully cooperated with the OHCHR in its efforts to fulfill the mandate under Resolution 43/1 by providing details on the
I thank you. I now give the floor to Azerbaijan. You have 3 minutes. there is a technical issue, so we'll come back for Azerbaijan. Now I give the floor to DBRK. You have 3 minutes. Oh, okay. We still have a technical problem. We'll come back.